Okay, so this is joint work with Mark Armstrong. And as Monica said, the title is Multi-Product Cost Pass-Through, Edgeworth's Paradox of Taxation Revisited. And somewhat cheekily, we have given as our affiliation, I mean, accurately, All Souls College, Oxford. We haven't mentioned the Department of Economics, though we are, of course, both a part of or affiliated to that. So one reason for the cheekiness, the reason is in fact to do with Edgeworth. So some of you viewing will know the layout of Oxford. Most of you, I guess, will not. So the university as a whole has 30, nearly 40 independent colleges, as well as various departments. And in the college that Mark and I are at, All Souls College, 100 years ago, there was precisely one economist, and it was Edgeworth. So here is it's not just a picture of Edgeworth, it's a picture of Edgeworth. So this hangs on the wall in the coffee room, where we go almost daily. And depending on your pixel quality, you see there that he was a member of the college, a fellow of the college, from 1891 to his death in 1926. So 35 years, the majority of his adult life. And I think he's a completely fascinating figure. I mean, a legendary figure in our subject, but in all sorts of other ways too. Now, he came to the professorship at Oxford in 1891, as you see there, 10 years after his masterpiece with the strange title Mathematical Psychics, where all the basic economics 101 apparatus of the contract curve, Edgeworth boxes, as they came later to be known, the stunning result about what we would now say the core of an exchange economy as you replicate it, shrinking to the set of competitive equilibria. That was all in his 1881 masterpiece. But he did extremely important work in economics, economic theory, mathematical economics, a huge amount in statistical theory. The majority of his papers in this period were statistical theory rather than economic theory. And throughout this, he was the editor of the Economic Journal for nearly all this period. And I want to focus on a paper published in 1897. So it was during the period he was here in the college, on the pure theory of monopoly. So this is not a last century paper. This is a one before the last century paper. He was, Edgeworth was proficient in a whole range of languages, ancient and modern. And he published a few times in this Italian journal. He had disputes with Pareto and all sorts. And the English language version of this appeared in his collected papers of 1925, published by the Royal Economic Society. This paper of 1897, which is about multi-product monopoly, turned out to be very controversial. And Mark and I think it relates to a number of very contemporary issues in IO, in the theory of monopoly, relating to cost pass-through. So I'm weaving a thread, hooking it back to Edgeworth in the 1890s as a sort of motivation for some contemporary concerns. So in this, the most striking result in this paper is his so-called paradox of taxation, which says that if you consider a multi-product monopolist, profit maximizing multi-product monopolist, and imagine imposing a tax on one of the products, one of the several products that the firm supplies, or equivalently, it could be an upward shift in unit cost of that product. Edgeworth showed that it was possible that, counter to, I think, more or less everybody's intuitions, that cost increase, the tax increase, could lead to a reduction in all the prices charged by the monopolist, including the price of the more costly product. He gave an example, a kind of hard to understand example of railway tickets, where he showed that if you put a tax on first-class tickets, it might lead to the price of both first and second class tickets decreasing. And I'd like to sort of paint two extreme ways one could think about this. One, which was the reaction of a number of eminent economists at the time, was that this is sort of crazy, weird curiosity. Even if it's mathematically correct, this just shows that mathematical economics is, can lead you to barking up the wrong tree. This isn't proper economics. This is no way to do things. The other view, which I think is the better one, is to say, what's really going on here is Edgeworth is saying that our intuitions trained on the single product case can lead us astray when we get to the multi-product case. And this really matters because all actual firms are multi-product, not single product. So in a sense, the overarching theme of all this is to think about how our very natural intuitions for the single product world, textbook world, to what extent do or don't they carry over to the multi-product case, which is the actual case. Now, in this same paper, 1897, Edgeworth also talked about a milder paradox, which we're calling the surplus paradox. So here the idea is that the cost increase or tax on one product could lead to greater consumer surplus than in the pre-tax situation. So I would say still paradoxical, but it's not as paradoxical as the sharp form of the paradox of taxation, because that sharp form involves all prices decreasing. Whereas for the surplus paradox, you could have the price of the tax good go up, but the prices of the other goods go down enough to boost consumer surplus. So in a minute, I want to give some intuition about why this is not a crazy possibility at all, either the price paradox or the surplus paradox. But let me start with something about the single product case, where one of our intuitions is absolutely correct, which is that even in the multi-product case, the output of the tax product, the more costly product, that does always fall. So all the economics here is going to be about compensating adjustments of other products. So that's the paradox of taxation in sharp form and in its milder surplus paradox form. As I mentioned, the 1897 paper in Italian came out in the 1925 English version of the collected works. There was a paper by Harold Hotelling a few years after that in the JPE, quite a long paper, very thorough paper. They're extremely impressive, these old papers, where he, I think, put on a much more mainstream basis and gave other easier to grasp examples of Edgeworth's paradox. So that was 1932. Hotelling's name isn't on the screen because of the way they paginate in the JPE, but I promise you that is his paper. And in what Mark and I are doing, a number of our taking off points are rooted in the Hotelling paper as much as the Edgeworth paper. And I think this Hotelling paper, in a sense, nailed it as this isn't just weird curiosity stuff. There's something really important going on here. Now, in the paper, Mark and I are still working on this paper. It's going to be very short. It's the current draft about 12 pages long, so I should have plenty of time to take us through the main points here today. I'm going to begin with an example of Edgeworth's paradox. Then that's after I've explained the setup and indeed talked about the point about the output of the tax good going down. But after those preliminaries, I'm going to give you an example, then going to show how it can arise when we're in a constrained situation, constrained to have uniform pricing. It's a very, very simple condition then where Edgeworth's paradox can arise. Then going to turn to the cost side, show how entirely for cost reasons, this is very much in the spirit of Hotelling, it can happen. Then to what we probably think of as the main result, we want to show a connection between Ramsey pricing. We often think of Ramsey as the sort of multi-product pricing person of that era, show a connection between Ramsey pricing and the surplus version of the Edgeworth paradox. It's an incredibly simple connection, joining Edgeworth and Ramsey in a sense. And then finally, using that connection, the Ramsey connection, show how you can find further examples of the Edgeworth paradox. Now, there isn't going to be time to talk about contemporary literature in any detail. I put up there 3 papers only, 2 on cost pass-through. This is all JPE, actually, all those 3 are JPE. Glenn Weil and Michael Fabinger, 2013, had a paper on cost pass-through. Recent issue of the JPE, Janine Iglastal, Greg Schaffer, correct and extend the Weil and Fabinger paper, and they link it, and Weil and Fabinger talked about this too, to theory of price discrimination. So I'm just flagging those up, doing no more than that today. And then 3 years ago, Mark and I had this paper called Multi-Product Pricing Made Simple in the JPE, where we sought to do a number of things, and we're going to use some of the apparatus there in today's talk. We tried to promote consumer surplus as a function of quantities as a very good way of thinking about a lot of monopoly and oligopoly problems. We're all familiar with the indirect utility function, consumer surplus as a function of the price vector. We're saying you can get quite a long way thinking of it as alternatively, like the dual, as a function of the quantity vector. We made a Cournot-Ramsey connection between oligopoly theory and monopoly theory. And we specified a pretty broad family of demand functions in which all the familiar examples that we often use, whether it's linear demand, CES, logit, all those things, they all nest within that structure. And the only thing we said about Edgeworth paradox in that paper was that it cannot arise in that family of demand functions when you also have constant returns to scale. So in a sense, today's point is going to be to take us outside the family that the paper with Mark 3 years ago was talking about. The setup, though, which I'll now come to, is essentially the same as in that paper. So here's the setup, and we're going to put it to work in various ways. So we've got a monopolist, multi-product, so the number of products is 2 or greater. Products are indexed by K, so PK and XK are the price and quantity of product K. And P and X without subscripts, those denote vectors, the price vector and the quantity vector. Total output, obviously that's a scalar quantity, big X, that's the sum of the XKs. Then the preference structure, we've got in a way, the primitive is the gross consumer utility function U of X, which is assumed strictly concave in the normal way. The price vector, price is marginal utility, so the upside down triangle, the sort of grad function, that's the that means that the price vector equals the vector of partial derivatives of U with respect to X. And then revenue is the dot product of the price vector and the quantity vector, all completely standard. Consumer surplus is a function of quantities, which I highlighted a moment ago. That's the utility U of X minus revenue of X. So that's consumer surplus, and we're going to be seeing quite a lot about that later. The profit function, pi of X, I'm doing it all as functions of quantities, that's revenue less cost. So C of X is the cost function. It's a multi-product cost function, because remember, X here is the vector of outputs. If the firm were a pure profit maximizer, it would choose the X vector, possibly subject to constraints, to maximize pi of X. We take the slightly more general form that they're maximizing phi, which is a weighted average of profit pi and consumer surplus S, where alpha is some weight on surplus between 0 and 1. So when alpha is 0, that's pure profit maximization. When alpha is 1, that's like, quote, total welfare maximization. and we've got a range of things in between. So we think of alpha as a kind of Ramsey parameter, because the Ramsey problem of maximizing profit subject to consumer surplus constraint boils down to maximizing, for some value of alpha, a weighted average of profit and consumer surplus with weight less than 1 on consumer surplus. As an aside, let me just say a bit more in that JPE paper with Mark 3 years ago. There, our Cournot-Ramsey result was that for an appropriate choice of alpha, you can characterize and show the existence of symmetric multi-product Cournot equilibrium using this kind of apparatus. So it forms a bridge between oligopoly, Cournot oligopoly, and Ramsey pricing. So that's the basic setup. Now, let's see, this is incredibly simple, but let's see why the output of a good that is taxed, or a good whose cost has an upward shift, why the resulting output of that good will be lower than in the pre-tax situation. So let curly X is a set of feasible quantities. Often that would be any real number in the unconstrained case, the sort of n vector of positive reals. But we might be interested in some constrained situations, and I'll come on to one in a minute. But suppose that in that set curly X, initially the vector X naught maximizes the objective phi of X. Then a tax is imposed, or we get the cost shift on product K. Suppose now that X star is the vector in the permitted set that maximizes. Now we've got the original objective, but we've also got to subtract the tax which the firm must pay on product K. So the top inequality there just states that if X star is the best thing in the situation with the tax, then you get the inequality at the top. But the second inequality follows too, because we said that X naught was the best choice in the pre-tax situation. So this is by, if you like, revealed preference. We instantly get that X naught of K is at least as great as X star of K. So the tax has the effect of diminishing the supply of product K. Now, where then could the Edgeworth paradox come from? I mean, if it was a single product situation, we'd be done. We know that output falls, so single product price must rise, consumer surplus falls. But in the multi-product situation, we're going to have adjustments of all the other products. And if we reduce, if I'm the firm and I reduce the supply of good K, it may well be that that will cause an adjustment upwards in the supply of other products that I'm supplying. And those adjustments could cause prices, including even the price for good K, to come down. That's why the Edgeworth paradox is possible. Even if that doesn't happen, it could fairly easily happen that the adjustments would cause consumer surplus to go up because you're increasing the other supplies by enough to offset the pulling back of supply of XK. So it's all these adjustments which are the sort of bread and butter of the multi-product case, and where our single product intuitions don't always get us going. So we thought we should give you an example of the pricing paradox. Well, maybe it's not saying much. I think it's more intuitive than Edgeworth's example. And I would claim more intuitive than the hoteling examples as well. But here is an intuition-driven way to get the paradox going. So suppose that the utility function of the representative consumer takes the form indicated at the top there, where there are two sub-utility functions, UA and UB, and the consumer, as it were, picks the one that they like best, given what the firm is doing. So this is a bit like one-stop shopping. The consumer either goes to shop A, regime A, or goes to shop B, regime B. And what we can do is to set it up so that B has more elastic demand than A, And also, let's say a lower supply of product K, which is the one we're going to tax or have a cost increase. So the way you can set this up, and a very simple example follows, but one can do it in much more generally, is that it could start off, let's say, in a situation where all costs are normalized to zero, where the firm facing the incentive compatibility constraint of the consumer prefers regime A, high prices. But if the cost of product one goes up enough, because product one is being used relatively more in regime A than regime B, that could flip everything to the other regime, which has more elastic demand and therefore lower prices. So very simple example, regime A, the demand for each product is 1 unit inelastic up to reservation price of 1. Regime B has the linear demands you see there in the centered pair of equations. So demand for X1 is 1 minus P1. Demand for X2, apologies for the typo, it should say 5 times 1 minus P2 there. Now, if costs are zero, the firm can extract all consumer surplus by going to regime A. It can get profit of 2. And the consumer won't want, even though getting no surplus, they're getting no surplus in regime B at that price either. So the incentive compatibility constraint is met. But if product one gets more and more expensive, then the firm does better to induce choices in regime B. And in this particular example, if C1 is greater than root 3 minus 1, then the outcome will not be the two prices very close to 1, which is the low cost situation. But as you wind up the cost of product 1, you flip to the situation where the price of good 2 halves and the price of good 1 goes to a half of 1 plus C1. So both prices drop discretely, they jump down, and the price of good 2 indeed drops. So the key ingredients here are one regime more elastic than the other, and the relative use of the of good K being much greater in regime than regime B. So you can rig up these examples without too much difficulty. That's an example of the Edgeworth paradox. And now in the remaining few slides, I'm going to run through some other examples, then take us on to the Ramsey equivalence result. So consider the following constrained situation. Imagine that there's some regulation, I think in economic terms, not a very sensible one, which requires all the prices to be the same. So suppose that for political or other reasons, there is a regulation that says you cannot charge different prices for different products, even though their costs might differ. So here the work of Chen and Schwartz and Rand Journal comes to mind. But let's suppose you've got this simple regulation in place. And we do see regulations like that. You're not allowed to charge, let's say, different men and women, different prices for insurance products or pension products, things of that kind. We do see such regulations. Now, you can easily get the Edgeworth paradox in that world. I'm sorry, this is called a theorem. It's not as grand as that, but I couldn't get the software to tone it down. When uniform pricing is required, the price decreases if the cost of product K rises, if and only if the demand for product K as a function of the common price is increasing in that common price. And that is entirely possible consistently with demand theory. You can't have it with discrete choice, but you can have it in a wide range of other situations. Because as all the prices go up, the PK goes up, and that tends to reduce demand for good K. But the other prices going up tends to increase demand for good K if they're substitutes. So it's perfectly possible that the condition in that so-called theorem is met. And by Slutsky's symmetry, it's the same condition as total quantity being increasing in the price of good K alone. So here's a little example of it, linear demand example. The way this is set up, you'll see that demand for good 1 up at the top on the left that is decreasing in its own price, good. It's increasing in the price of the other good, in this two good example, perfectly natural, it substitutes. But you'll see that as the common price rises, if P1 equals P2, then demand for good one is actually increasing in the common price. There's no violation of standard postulates of demand theory here. And the profit maximizing price, let's set cost of good 2 equal to 0. The profit maximizing price as a function of the cost of good 1 is 1 minus C1 over 8. So the profit maximizing uniform price goes down with the cost. So this is very simple illustration of Edgeworth's paradox in a constrained world. And if we didn't have the constraint, then you'd have the two centered prices towards the bottom of that slide. The first one of which is way higher than the profit maximizing uniform price, the other of which is a bit higher than that. So here, both standalone prices exceed the profit maximizing uniform price. And that indeed is intimately related, there isn't time today, to the fact assumed that the demand for good 1 is increasing in the common price. You'll notice from those two pricing equations near the foot of that slide, there is no cross-cost pass-through. So the price of good 2 is independent from the price of good 1. And that's an instance of a much more general result in the paper with Mark 3 years ago. Right, so that's a uniform pricing example. Now, let's assume there are no constraints on pricing, so we're now away from that world. Let's briefly look at cost conditions. Hotelling had a very interesting example of this, linear example. He had product differentiation and things going on the cost side. We can make it even cleaner by taking very much his style of example, but assuming homogeneous goods, homogeneous products. And then let's think of the cost function, because if we've got homogeneous goods, then everything's just going to depend on total output. So let the cost function be this big C of big X, that's cost as a function of total output. That's simply the min of the multi-product cost function such that the sum of the outputs equals big X, total output. Now, if you do a tax on product K, we all know that by the envelope theorem, that's going to increase total cost, but it doesn't follow at all that that increases marginal cost. And since total output, utility, and so on is going to depend on how marginal cost varies with the tax, we need to work out what the tax on good K does to marginal cost. And you'd think, well, it's pretty obvious it's going to go up, isn't it? Well, the answer is no, it's not obvious that it goes up, and it doesn't always go up. And in the two good case, to cut to the chase here in view of time, if you have that condition at the foot there, at the bottom, so this is a condition on second derivatives, where the second derivative of cost with respect to good J, different from K, that's the other product. If for one of the J's, that's less than the cross partial, which is entirely possible, consistent with standard theory of cost functions, then again, you're going to get the Edgeworth paradox of price decreasing as you increase the cost on good K. Now, 5 minutes left, that's time to do the Ramsey connection. So in all the examples so far, the one with the A and B, the one with prices regulated to uniformity, the one with the cost condition, these have all been examples of the full Edgeworth paradox. But we're quite interested in the milder one, where we don't require all the prices to come down, but we simply require that or examine when consumer surplus goes up with a tax on one good. Can't happen in the single product case. That's what a lot of our intuitions are trained on. But in the multi-product case, it clearly can happen, as all instances of the full Edgeworth paradox and many more show. So we realized in all these examples that what was going on when you have this tax on good K, you reduce supply of good K, this seemed very closely related to how quantity varies as you move between profit maximizing monopoly and marginal cost pricing. So along that continuum from pure profit maximization to marginal cost pricing, that's like varying the Ramsey parameter. So it dawned on us that there is the very simple relationship that you see in the top equation between, on the left-hand side, how consumer surplus varies with this tax on good K, and on the right-hand side, the negative of how the output of good K varies with the Ramsey parameter. Now, in economic terms, this seems quite a hard thing to get one's head around, because on one side is how surplus varies with a tax, on the other side is how output varies with a welfare weight. But mathematically, it's a one-line argument, because by the envelope theorem, both sides of that top equation are equal to the cross-partial derivative of the expression in square brackets in the second bullet point. Now, in a feature of the family of demand functions that Mark and I focused on in one of the core sections of our paper 3 years ago, the key thing there was that as you varied this Ramsey parameter, all the quantities moved equiproportionately with alpha. So because of that, you can't get the Edgeworth surplus paradox, because they all move in the same direction. But if you hop outside that family that we featured in the section of that paper, then it can quite easily happen. And indeed, you'll always get the surplus form of the Edgeworth paradox, if not the full works pricing form, if the profit maximizing quantity of some good exceeds its marginal cost pricing level. So this is a bit like a quantity equivalent of price being below marginal cost. It's saying the monopoly level of good K supply exceeds its marginal cost pricing level. And we're going to put a few examples of that. And they pop up all over the place. We're going to have a few examples of that in the paper. Let me just give you one discrete choice example here, and then I will wrap. So discrete choice, 2 products, 2 consumer types, and let's suppose they're equal in number, these consumers, mass 1 of each. Type A people are willing to pay up to price 1 for 1 unit of product 2, but they don't like product 1 at all. Type B consumers have reservation price VK for a unit of product K, so they will choose the product, if any, with the higher VK minus PK. If both products were priced in excess of VK, then the type B people would not buy at all. Suppose initially costs are 0, and suppose further that V1 is less than V2. The B people like product T2 better than product 1. So everybody likes product 2 better than product 1. And if costs are 0, it's clearly efficient for all the supply to be of product 2. But the monopolist would not supply only product 2, because the best thing that the profit maximizing monopolist can do, if you make the middle assumption, the inequality there, that monopolist under that condition can make more profit, can get 1 plus V1 by the strategy just below that chain of inequalities, by pricing product 1 at P1 or epsilon less, and product 2 at 1 or epsilon less than that. And that's more profitable for the monopolist than the strategy of supplying both products to both the A's and the B's at a price of V2. But if you now wind up the cost of good 1, then if the penultimate bullet there, if the cost of good 1 exceeds 1 plus V1 minus 2V2, then it becomes more profitable for the monopolist to flip and to supply product 2 to both types, leaving therefore type A people with positive surplus. So there's a simple example. It's a little bit in the spirit of the A's and the B's that we had earlier on, where a cost increase can flip you from to a regime with higher consumer surplus. And here again, the key Ramsey link is that the efficient supply of good 1 is 0, but the monopoly supply of good 1, if the cost of good 1 is low, is positive. So this is just one of, and there's a whole host of illustrations of the surplus paradox. Indeed, this one here is, in weak form also gives you the full Edgeworth pricing paradox. So to wrap up, I think the way to think about the Edgeworth paradox is not as a curiosity, but as a warning that single product intuitions don't necessarily carry over to the multi-product case. And it really matters because the real world is multi-product. That said, his pricing paradox, you've got to work quite hard to get that, as he indeed did. But the surplus paradox, which we think has independent interest, is much more common and has this nice, we think nice Ramsey connection. And examples are not that hard to find, and they occur whenever the monopoly supply of a product exceeds its efficient level. That's that. Thank you very much again for inviting me. I'll stop sharing now.
Thank you very much, John, for this super clear presentation. So clear and so pedagogical that there were no clarifying questions during your talk. So I will now pass the words to Germain Gaudin for a discussion.
Thank you very much, Monica, and thanks a lot, John, for the nice presentation. I understand that the role of this discussion is mostly to kick off the overall, Q&A session. So I did not prepare any slides. I hope it's fine for you. Just also a quick warning is that my connection is actually relatively unstable. So feel free to jump in if some of the words I've said have been lost sometime, and I will try to repeat those. So thanks a lot, John, for sharing this very nice, short, but full of ideas papers with me, and for the extremely clear presentation. I think looking at this, I'm just wondering, how many papers or in which directions you should go from there on. I mean, there is so much material there, so much kind of seeds to explore, and that I found that it's unclear in which direction you will go from there on. So you have those various results on the paradox related to the uniform pricing, on the cost conditions, and then you move on to this surplus paradox, which, as you said, is still paradoxical, but not as paradoxical. And the overall high-level comments that I would have is, what is then a paradox? Are we really talking about a paradox or not? So as you said in your concluding slide, actually, you said that in the world of multi-product firms, this is actually not that much of a curiosity, right? And on top of that, the world of multi-product firm is actually most of the world that we know in real life. So, I think that kind of work is very, very much welcome, because that helps us to challenge, potentially wrong established ideas that we have, which are based on, simple models, but are not necessarily fitted to the actual world. So let me move to the first part of the paper, which is that related to this uniform pricing rule. So actually, finding a paradox there, according to the example that you showed us, is, when I saw that, I was thinking, this is almost too simple, ultimately. How come that arises in such a simple setting? So there is a long line of work in this kind of non-price discrimination rules, or even more, there is a line of work in those regulations between prices. I mean, John, you know that very well. You've published on this recently. Is that sometimes there are some regulations that would set a certain upper bound on the gap between the two prices that, say, a multi-product monopolist would set for their goods. If there is a no price discrimination clause, that means that this gap is 0. if there is, complete freedom for the multi-product monopolies to set their prices as they want, means that the gap may be whatever the gap between the two, optimal prices are. But there is a whole range in between. And, from your examples, the one that you showed us in the paper and the one that you discuss in the slides, we can try to look at what is the regulated gap between those two prices, at which we would have the Edgeworth paradox or not. And that gap would naturally be a function of the cost of the firms, but I think that could be an interesting thing to discuss in your paper as well. Then moving on to the cost section, and you restating, or as you said, make the original hoteling model clearer. I fully agree, and this was my main comment there, is that you kind of decompose this hoteling example in two different sections, and that's very well explained in the short paper. Is that on the one hand, you show, as you told us, that the key feature is that we have this cost function, which is going to be a sum modular. On the other hand, you explain also the other aspect of the original hoteling model, where there is differentiation with linear demands, plus the feature that total demand is increasing in one of the prices, right? So those two together are the building blocks of original hoteling's example, and you do an excellent job in disentangling those and explaining to us what's going on there. And then I also really appreciate what you told us about the surplus paradox, which, as you can say, may arise maybe more naturally, in more common settings than the price-related paradox. And your proposition 3 in the paper, the results that you told us about, is actually very, very clean and quite powerful. So from there on, I was wondering, what to add to that, or in which direction one could bring those results. So overall, I was wondering if there is something to say, by adding extra components in the model. So that's something we can think of, and if there's something interesting to be said when we consider also the effects on a variety supply by the monopolist, right? And this may link to what you tell us about the surplus paradox a little bit, because some of your examples have the feature that ultimately after or before the cost shock on one of the product, one of the demands would actually be set to zero in equilibrium according to the prices set by the monopolist. So, here we may find something related to sales with, variety supply overall from the monopolist, and that may be related to some of the, the AER paper by Hamilton in 2009. There's something maybe there about multi-product firms competing, taxes, and this kind of supply of variety. Now, beyond those examples, of course, it's naturally to ask what would happen under competition, but that's probably a long way to go there. But bringing competition into the picture may also force us to scratch our head on whether there could be even a profit paradox there, right? So we know that in some cases, like let's say we know the work of Resuciad for the Kono competition, if we have extremely convex market demand, we can have a very weird case that so a tax for all the firms could actually increase the firm's profits. So I'm just wondering if there is also something to be said there, and maybe in the multi-product world that comes up more naturally than in a single product world. And to conclude, just maybe some at the very border of what you told us, I'm wondering if there are also some links to be made with more recent adjacent literature. So we have, for instance, the paper by Alexandrov and Bedré Defolier in the JET on the Le Chatelier-Samuelson principle, and this short run versus long run effects of, let's say a tax, for instance, or a price change, and if there is something to be said in relation to your model there. Or on the other hand, there is also a nice paper in the RAND last year or this year by Anna D'Annunzio, Mardan, and Russo, where they look actually at taxation, where we have, not multi-product necessarily, but multi-tariff settings. And there, there is a connection to be made in some sense that, multi-tariffs and can be seen sometimes as multi-product with perfect complementarity. So, maybe there is also something here adjacent to your work. But I'll stop here to leave some room for the general discussion. Thanks a lot again for the great paper and very clear presentation.